purpose of stories, I think, is a kind of flight simulator for human beings to try and work out how they should behave and what they should do when very difficult situations come along. Because what roots all forms of drama are really, well, choices, I suppose. You know, a story without choices is a very dead story, and that's the thing that we find most difficult to negotiate as human beings, is we don't know what the hell to do, because it's a very complicated world and we're very tiny creatures, and we're trying to work out what might be the consequences of certain kinds of actions. And to my mind, that's really what is constantly being played out in dramas, which is what would happen if.
Welcome to the New Flesh Podcast, the podcast you deserve. My name is Ricky Allpike. Joining me once again is Mr. Jonathan Astro. John, what's on the menu today?
Well, I'm very excited. We've got a story expert with us today. And, you know, this is part of our push to get people interested in stories and reading and art and culture. I got to tell Ricky, I got to be honest with you, it's a tough slog.
It is a tough slog.
I feel like people, and I'm talking to you, dear listener, I feel like some people are the thumb is hovering over the skip button. And if you do that, then you're a bad person. And you should, you know, like...
Take a break from the culture wars, I say, you know?
Just stop it. Just stop with Twitter and, you know, arguments about what is a woman for 5 minutes and whatever. I mean, yeah, I get it. I'm with you.
Yeah. What is a story?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it.
Well, we always tell you the truth here at the New Flesh Podcast, and the truth is that we need your help. We need you to leave us a rating or review wherever you listen to the show. We're also on YouTube, so please subscribe to our YouTube channel and leave a comment about a show you liked, or perhaps one that you didn't. Word of mouth is also a very powerful tool, so please tell all of your friends. And finally, to our Uber fans, if you love what we do, you can send us a little cash via the Buy Me a Coffee platform. Any donation here is very much appreciated. Now, on with the show.
Tim Lott has authored 10 novels and a memoir. The Scent of Dried Roses is a Penguin modern classic, which blows my mind. Actually, having written a book with one of those beautiful green spines, I'm sure the inside's very good too, Tim. He has been published in 16 countries and has worked extensively as a screenwriter. He's taught screenwriting for the last 10 years. Writing for the last 10 years. He's taught at the Faber Academy, Guardian Masterclasses, the Novelry and Brunel University, and has lectured at the University of East Anglia, the How To Academy, the Idler Academy, and the School of Life. He's here to talk to us about his new book on writing called Yes, No, But Wait, the one thing you need to know how to write a novel. Tim, welcome to the New Flesh.
Thank you very much. And I think that the interesting thing about the title of that novel, the new book, is that it has to be dramatized. So it has to be a yes, no, but wait. I think that's the complicated thing about that title. You just can't give it. You can't give it out flat like that. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, but
so you got to try.
Okay.
You got to try again.
Okay, all right. Yes, no, but wait.
Yes, that's it. That's the title of the book.
So it only really works in an audio book sort of form.
But totally, yeah, it's a disaster. It's just simply as a title. It's only when you actually speak it that it
Other
makes
people
sense.
are going to butcher that way more than I did. By the way, you're going to be at a Q&A
Let's hope so.
for the next year, and someone's going to it's going to be said in like a Romanian accent. They'll be yes, no, but wait. And you're just going to have to put up with it.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll let it go. You know, I don't know. I just feel cantankerous today.
Well, Tim, we have a final question that we ask all of our listeners, but it seems appropriate. A final question, yeah, but it seems appropriate to put it at the start of this particular interview. We would like to know what you're reading right now.
Okay, so I am reading. I have ADHD, which means I have about 10 books going, which I'm all 50 pages into at the same time. So the answer isn't simple, but I'm reading The Western Intellectual Tradition by Jacob Bronowski, which that establishes what a clever guy I am, but I don't understand a lot of it. But I always try to educate myself. I'm reading Extraordinary Women by a 1950s writer called Barbara Pym. which I'm finding rather dull. And I'm about to start reading this book by Willie Vlautin called The Night Always Comes. I'm a big fan of Willie Vlautin. And I'm reading a book about Alan Watts, who's a kind of philosopher figure who I'm fascinated by. So I'm very Catholic in my taste. I have lots of different things. My main thing is I tend not to read very much new fiction because I find it disappointing on the whole. So I tend to turn to classic fiction much more than new writers.
How old are you willing? Well, sort of how new are you willing to go? Where's the cutoff? Is it a rolling wall of 10, 20 years, 50 years? How long?
I'm suspicious of anything that came out in the last 10 years on the whole, at least on this side of the Atlantic. I'm much more positive about American writers on the whole, and Australian writers actually. There's one Australian writer I read, a very, very good book. I have terrible memory for these things. It was called The Shepherd's Hut, I believe, or something like that, and it was a really good book, really good story. But that's kind of the only example I can come up with. But on this side of this is kind of the nub of my book. Yes, no, but wait. I just sort of think that it's the central focus of novels being, in my mind, story has given way to other more esoteric concerns like style, voice, and to some extent character. But there's not much narrative drive in a lot of these novels that have been published in the last 10 years. They're often very clever and very well thought out and very much of the moment. But I get bored very quickly and they don't hold my attention. So that's why I go further back when I think people, I'm also reading Sunset Morn, of Human Bondage. But the further back you go, the more commitment there is to the craft of writing, to the craft of storytelling, to understanding what makes a narrative interesting, what makes it interesting for a reader, as opposed to interesting for the writer, which is quite a different thing. And I think a lot of, I'm probably full of prejudices here, but I just tend to think that a lot of modern writers are rather self-indulgent and don't think about the reader so much as they think about how much they're going to be applauded for their sophistication of delivery.
Well, the book is loaded with fantastic quotations from other artists and thinkers who've wrestled with this story problem. Robert McKee, David Mamet, John Yorke, just to name but a few. There's many more. But so, what was your own specific goal? Because you've obviously read widely in this field of story. So, what was your particular corner of this battle?
Well, that's very simple. It's writing this stuff for novelists. All those people that you mentioned write for dramatists and screenwriters. And I'm a novelist, and it's here within novel writing and fiction writing that this kind of canker of non-plot has taken hold. It's considered almost vulgar to think about plot, and it's certainly not true in film and TV series and streaming services. There's a really high quality writing going on. And there's no way they can get away with it. It's really just in literary fiction, particularly in Great Britain, that you're finding this, to me, sapping away of narrative energy. So I was really trying to import these ideas that I think screenwriters and dramatists are very familiar with, or should be, into the world of writing a novel. And I think one of the reasons that it's so neglected as a kind of craft in novel writing is that a lot of the editors themselves are not schooled in storytelling. They're schooled in literature, And literature is a very different thing. They always seem to come from academic literature backgrounds, and they don't really focus on things like character and plot. They more focus on things like, well, what do they focus on? I mean, rather esoteric literary theory quite often, which is all very well and good if you like that sort of thing, but it doesn't really help you write a book. And my task, my project, is to offer practical advice, the emphasis on practical, to how to put together a novel in as far as you can put together a novel, because a novel is not a machine, it's not an object, it's a organism that you have to grow. It's not a Meccano set that you put together. Craft is only a relatively, I wouldn't say minor part of it. It has to be in there, but knowing all the craft in the world is not going to get you a good novel. On the other hand, not knowing any craft at all is unlikely to produce a readable novel.
So, what can a novel do that a screenplay or a teleplay or that can't do? Do you know what I mean? How do you get that balance just right? So, we're going to ask you this at the very end about Cormac McCarthy. We'll probably talk about him, but for example, I read Blood Meridian, and I feel like that can't be filmed. That is a novel, and it feels like it gets inside my soul and my brain and my bones. But then I read No Country for Old Men, and I think all that's missing is the scene headings from No Country for Old Men. It's so
Yeah.
spare; it could almost be a screenplay.
Yeah, well, the thing is that if you're Cormac McCarthy, you can get away with all sorts of things because you're such a fantastic writer. And that's the point. You can also get away with it if you're maybe Anne Tyler or Carl Ognausgaard. Because the quality of your prose is so luminous, that it's true the plot doesn't matter so much. But most people don't have that kind of quality of style. I certainly don't. I mean, it's just very, very rare. And I think a lot of writers go in there rather thinking they can not have to worry about plot too much, because their prose is so dazzling. That they're going to. I mean, the truth is that it isn't almost always that dazzling. And us lesser mortals have to rely on basic storytelling techniques to get the reader engaged. Yes, there are. Cormac McCarthy is a good example. I know The Road also is a very, very narrative. It's a journey. It starts somewhere, ends somewhere, and has lots of sort of adventures, very dark adventures in between. So that's a classic dramatic structure, you might say. The Road, a journey from A to B. But I just think that he's got the choice. He can do what he likes because he's good enough. But I think most people don't understand that you can ignore the rules, not that they are rules, they're principles. You can ignore them if you know that you're ignoring them, if you know what you're doing, if you understand them in the first place. Then you can say, well, I'm not going to use them. I'm going to use something else to sell this book. But you have to know them in the first place. And most writers, it seems to me, don't know these very fundamental dramatic principles. Writers of novels.
Well, Tim, I've got a big question for you that maybe I should have opened with this one. What is a story, and what is the purpose of stories?
Okay, well, technically speaking, a plot and a story are different. I mean, a story, and I mean, informally we talk about a story. Technically speaking, a story is well, if your children come home from school and tell you about what they did at school today, they tripped on a brick and grazed their knee, and then someone gave them a sweet, and then Jenny was not nasty to them, and then they got given a pretty picture. That's a story. It's just one thing after the other. It's not constructed. It's not got any structure to it. A plot is constructed. it's an artificial thing that a storyteller makes with, a act structure usually, and that act structure at its most basic is, this is why John Yorke calls his book Into the Woods, is basically you start off in a place where everything is kind of normal. The protagonist gets knocked off balance and then spends the rest of the novel trying to get back on balance again. And that's man falls in hole, and has to get out again. It's the oldest dramatic structure there is, and it works basically. There are other dramatic structures. I mean, people like George Lucas and the Star Wars franchise doesn't rely so much on the 3-act structure as something constructed around Joseph Campbell, the mythologist, who tried to see how storytelling and myths were linked. And, there are whole books on how that produced a different paradigm, as it were, for storytelling, which was more based on mythology and Jungian psychology, actually, because no one really quite knows, how stories work completely. There are just different approaches, but they're only, John Yorke has his own approach, which is kind of the idea that every single scene is a microcosm of the larger story, which I think is much too prescriptive for a novelist. Novels are a much baggier form than plays or screenplays. So you can get away with a lot more, but you still have to have some sort of shape. And that's what a story is. And what was the second question, Ricky? I've forgotten.
What's the purpose of stories?
The purpose of stories, I think, is a kind of flight simulator for human beings to try and work out how they should behave and what they should do when very difficult situations come along. Because what roots all forms of drama are really, well, choices, I suppose. A story without choices is a very dead story. And that's the thing that we find most difficult to negotiate as human beings, is we don't know what the hell to do, because it's a very complicated world and we're very tiny creatures. And we're trying to work out what might be the consequences of certain kinds of actions. And to my mind, that's really what is constantly being played out in dramas, which is what would happen if, or what would happen if this happened and that choice was made? What would the consequences be? And storytellers kind of try to imagine what the consequences might be. And it's a very loose art, but that's the obsession that we all have with storytellers as story consumers, whether it's on television, on stage, or in books, is firstly, what kind of choices should I make? And secondly, who am I? Because that's the great unanswerable question that art of all kinds, since its beginning, has tried to address. And really, all great stories are stories of who is this person? What do they appear to be, and what are they underneath? Because a person comes from the word persona, which means mask, and we all live behind masks, and we can't really, or it's very difficult to know what's going on behind the mask. Not only for other people looking at us, but for us looking at us. There's a whole unconscious world that we inhabit. And we don't really know what's going on in that unconscious world. And part of the job of the story is to try and give us some signposts or pointers, and try and say, well, this is some signposts within the woods, shall we say, that we're all lost in to some extent, because life is very mysterious, and storytellers just try and maybe help you orient yourself a little.
Do you think that the ability to tell stories has sort of helped the evolution of the human race?
It's more than helped the evolution. It's provided for the survival of the human race. I mean, I don't think there could have been a human race without stories. They're there right from the beginning in some form, if only in the form of religion and ritual, which is, according to some anthropologists, I can't remember the name of the place. I think it's in Turkey where they recently discovered a city, which anthropologists and archaeologists and all those people who deal with old stuff, they originally thought that people built cities and then afterwards they became religions. But this site in Turkey seems to indicate the opposite, that people created. Yes, I know I should have turned off my phone, but you didn't tell me.
That's fine.
Okay. Yeah. So I forgot what I was saying.
Turkey.
Turkey cities.
Yeah. Turkey. So they discovered on this site, which may even come back to me at some point, that it was the temple that was built first, and the city built up round the temple. So basically, what people are doing, well, the first thing human beings do is they tell stories to each other once they've got language in order to tell stories, and that, of course, took quite a lot of evolving before we had language sufficient to tell stories. I mean, John York has not John York. Robert McKee has an interesting theory, which I'm sort of inclined to go along with, which is that when human beings became self-conscious, I don't know how long ago that might have been, whenever it was, a few million years ago, they would have been faced with a very uncomfortable fact, which no other animal had to face, which was that they were mortal, they were going to die. And that's something that no other animal, animals scamper around, they suffer, and they suffer, or they don't, but they don't think about it. Whereas we kind of have foreknowledge. We can see into the future, and in that future we see the thing that all animals are terrified of, which is death. And therefore we have to find some antidote to that. And the antidote to that is story. In the original form would be the story of the gods and the story of how we're all going to be okay after we die. That might be the original source of story because it's a kind of psychological survival mechanism. And without that, we simply would be too terrified to survive because we would be faced with our own imminent departures. And that's something even to this day. There's a rather wonderful book called The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, which suggests that all the civilizations that have ever been built are all built around the denial of death and trying to escape this reality. I'm getting rather deep than I want to get here, but it strikes me as quite convincing, and certainly we've reached a peak moment in that project now in the 21st century when we spend all our lives incredibly distracted and running around at 100 miles an hour, never really having a time to think about anything. So books, perhaps, because novels are ancestors, you might say, of myths. That they're not myths; they're made-up stories, but they aspire to be myths. That is, they aspire to be universal. They aspire to tell us something about ourselves that we cannot tell in a literal way. That's why novels are not lectures. They are trying to say things that cannot be said in a lecture. Or a non-fiction version. They're poetic truths, and you can't actually put your finger on them and what they mean. What does Hamlet mean? Well, lots of people have lots of ideas about what Hamlet means, but the point is, it's trying to reach towards some conclusion that we can't, oddly enough, put into words. So we put it into images and symbols and actions. And as I often say, the grammar of storytelling is not words, it's actions. It's what people do that we find compelling, not what they say.
It's funny you should bring up Hamlet. I just think that it is the most staggering piece of art. I can't believe that a human being wrote this thing. And you talk about not being able to put it into words. I completely agree with that. But when I get pretty close with Hamlet, because it's one of those things. If an alien came down and they said, "What's the point of all this?" I think I could show them that play and say, if you want to know how to be a friend, then there's a great friend in this play. If you want to know how to be a great father, and how to be a great son, how to be a great king, what happens if you mistreat women, like if you, it comes so close to all the most beautiful things, and it's I can't wrap my head around it.
Yeah, I mean, if he'd just written that one play, you'd just think, wow, that guy's a genius. And he wrote
That's right. He
he
knocked off
wrote
a few
22
others.
others, wrote 22 others, whatever it was, I
Yes.
mean, that's the extraordinary thing. But yeah, I agree with you. It's an extra. But then he wrote quite a few extraordinary. I mean, obviously, Hamlet was just one of his great plays.
So you cite change as being central to storytelling, and this really, we're just picking out little things that I think everyone should just read your book and go and write what they got to write if that's what they got to do. But we've just picked out things that really occurred to us, and change really jumped out at me here as being central to a story. Something or someone needs to change over the period. And I think it's uncontroversial to say that stories with irreparable change and lasting change are superior. I'm a big fan of that. So, for example, there's no going back for Michael Corleone in The Godfather, for example, and so novels and good cinema deliver this kind of knockout blow that we yearn for. So maybe you could talk about change, but the spicier part of this, the question is, what's your take on this shift towards episodic television and movies about multiple universes or straight up sequels and reboots? How can we experience the cathartic rush that comes from experiencing this change that we want to see, this irrevocable change, if the storyteller always has this ace up their sleeve?
That's a very interesting and complicated question. I do think all of those examples you gave of the multi-universe still are massively involved with change. I mean, there's always certainly external or internal. The change is constantly unfolding. I don't think it really matters. There are these mini-series and there are these multiverses. They're still having to undergo change for it to be interesting to the viewer or the audience. I don't think there's any escape from that. Yeah, I don't. I'm not quite sure what your point is. That somehow these new forms that have emerged are somehow, as it were, eschewing change, or what? What do you really mean?
Yeah, well, what I want is, I want to get to the end of a story and to feel like there can't be another frame, there can't be another page.
Right. Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
And I'm constantly being told that not only is there another page, there's 3 other movies and an end
Yeah.
credit
Yeah.
sequence and 4 other books, and I'm like, at the end of Five Easy Pieces, when the truck drives away, I'm like, that's the end of the story. When I mean, another Godfather one, but like, actually, this breaks what I just said, because when he shuts the door on Kay, everything's different. And then in number 2, when he kills Fredo, oh my god, So I mean, I suppose you can you can't just keep going.
You can, but I mean, you can if it's very carefully designed. Unfortunately, the economics of making TV now demand stretching a piece of elastic very, very thin, and that's really I mean, I totally agree with your analysis, and I think that both in movie sequels and in TV. What should we call? I don't like them calling them miniseries. It's a stupid term. I don't know what.
Limited series like True Detective, that sort of
Yeah,
or
anthology, limited series. I know TV series. But they occasionally can. I think True Detective may be a good example of one that does quite well carry on, really hitting good quality, and they give enough time to it. Fargo is another one. But on the whole, they're milking the cow for a few more quid, and that's not going to produce good television or film for that matter. So, that's a real. But you're right. At the moment a story ends is when no more change is possible, like you say, and when you're constantly sort of, well, that's why they go into backstory or go forward. They do anything to sort of get another inch out of the story, because people, having become familiar with the characters, want to re-experience the feeling. I mean, this is why great stories don't really usually sit well with sequels. I mean, Pinocchio 2, I don't know, it doesn't really work, does it? The Bible 2, you know,
I was about to
uh,
say that.
the Second Coming, that could be quite good. But I think that there's a sense in which you must never underestimate the power of commercial instincts in these things. And what's interesting, I think, about, to come back to my original point about literature in Great Britain, is how badly it sells. It's very commercially unsuccessful, as far as I can make out, except for genre fiction, which is a different matter. But genre fiction, the romances, detective stories, sci-fi, so forth, that sells. But the literary fiction, or non-genre fiction, which I prefer to think of it as, it does very badly commercially. And I think gradually the publishers begin to wake up to the fact, you need to learn how to tell a bloody story. Can I just say one thing before we continue? Because you mentioned my book a little while back, and at that point, before I took off on some other tangent, I just wanted to say that the stuff is in there is in my. I give all these lessons on Substack, so I wonder if you would mind if I just mention my Substack line,
Sure.
because all this stuff is there, and I'm always keen to harvest any new members of the community. So if anybody wants to join that community, it's at timlott.substack.com. timlott.substack.com, and that's where you'll find all my lessons and teaching and mentoring, and it's free partially. So that's my plug out of the way. So carry on.
Excellent. Well, we'll include a link to that in our show notes for anyone who's interested. Now, Tim, I have another broad question for you. What is character and what is characterization? And maybe you can give us a popular example people might recognize, say, I don't know, Breaking Bad, Mad Men, Game of Thrones, or maybe another example comes to mind.
Yeah, well, characterization is really the superficial aspects of somebody, what they look like, their kind of personal superficial history, what school they went to, and maybe some of their sort of obvious on the surface characteristics. Maybe they've got a slight tick, or maybe they are, quick to anger. They are one-dimensional in a sense. Maybe not one-dimensional, but two-dimensional, in that they'll have a series of accustomed. Aristotle said, character is repeated action. So it's basically the things that we all do, in a recognizable way, that make us who we are. From the rhythms of our speech, whether we speak fast or slow, whether we're aggressive or passive, all those things are part of, characterization. And there's, Tom and Jerry are characterized. They're purely, they don't do anything but be Tom and Jerry. They don't ever change. And that's fine. I've got no objection to these characterized most comedy characters are characterized. They're very superficial. They don't, Larry David and Curb Your Enthusiasm never changes. He's just always Larry David, and that's he's characterized in some senses, as someone who speaks brutal truths and gets into trouble for it. So characterization is fine, but as you say, in great stories, we're seeing underneath the persona, the mask, we're seeing a burrowing into what a person really is. We certainly see that in Breaking Bad, since you mentioned that. I mean, Walter White starts off as a sort of mild-mannered chemistry teacher who turns into this total monster. And what the whole story of Breaking Bad is watching the process of him dismantle his persona and, reach deep into his character to find this power-hungry, cruel person who'll do anything, despite the myth he creates for himself that he's doing it all for his family, which is bullshit. He's doing it because he loves power. He discovers that he loves power, and he's up until, at the beginning of the series, he just thinks he's a ordinary Joe, like any other ordinary Joe who's quite nice and inoffensive, and he discovers that he's not that at all. That's, I mean, Philip Pirrip in Great Expectations, starts off as somebody who's characterized as a, normal, well, not normal, but, he has a stroke of luck and becomes well off and moves to London. And therefore, he discovers, or perhaps is transformed into this prideful, rather arrogant character who then must fall from grace, in order to discover humility. And he's, as like King Lear, has to discover his humility through suffering. And that's the great motto, really, of life and storytelling: is you suffer your way to wisdom, and that's wisdom is invariably in the form of painful self-knowledge, and self-knowledge is something that we are all somewhat wary of approaching, because there's, we also like to think we're nice people who are, basically full of lovable, cuddly things. But I don't think we are. I think we're very divided creatures. We have very dark things inside us, all of us. We're just not put in a situation where those things have a chance to get out, because we're constrained by society, and we're constrained by trying to win the game of life, which involves appearing at least to be nice and friendly and sociable, because no one's going to work with you if you come across as evil. So we're all putting on masks. That's not to say that we know, and I don't think Walter White had any idea what he was capable of, and I don't think any average, if such a thing can exist, concentration camp guard of the Nazi regime 5 years previously had any idea that they would be forcing inmates to pick up bags of concrete and run across the camp from one side to the other till they dropped dead. They were never imagined that they were capable of such things. They just thought they were nice, ordinary people. So, what we're looking for is, it's not necessarily, people can discover good things about themselves too that they didn't know that were in there. The point is, it's a process of mining, and I think a lot of the fascination of storytelling comes from that process of a character discovering or trying to find out who they are. Lawrence of Arabia, is all about who this character T. Lawrence was, and there's a great moment very clearly when it's very clearly stated when he finally comes to, I think he's ridden across the desert against all the advice of wiser counsels and comes to, is it the Suez Canal? I can't remember, a canal anyway. And there's this, and he sees someone on the other side of the canal a Bedouin who shouts out, "Who are you?" And then there's this great shot of Lawrence's face, Peter O'Toole, utterly lost because he suddenly realizes he doesn't know who the hell he is. Is he an Arab? Is he an English gentleman? Is he a cruel murderer? Is he a peaceful man? He doesn't know. And the whole film is about, this is very well explored in Will Storr's book, The Science of Storytelling, in which he talks about Lawrence of Arabia at great depth, and I thought it was a brilliant analysis, actually. But that's all about trying to understand who this very complicated man is, and we're all very complicated. We may not think we are, but we are. And that's that characterization. Is that the question we're on? I've forgotten character and characterization, but I mean, the idea that it's all about trying to find out what your blind spots, and I think constructing a story is very much partly about trying to find out who your character's blind spots are, and then exposing them, because we all have them. Yeah, I'm just trying to think of, I mean, and contradictions, of course. Someone like Tony Soprano is probably the most contradictory character in storytelling. He loves women, he hates women, he wants to be a mob boss, but he wants to be a tender father. He's got. I mean, this is why he's having all these blackouts, because he's so full of contradictions, so many things that he has to be simultaneously. He can't be. That he's breaking down, and that's what's fascinating, watching him struggle with that. Same with Walter White, and they're all keeping secrets. I remember there's a point when I was watching The Sopranos, Breaking Bad, and Dexter, about the serial killing sort of police, and I thought, why am I so compelled by all these three characters? And I thought, and then I thought, well, what it is they're all spending all their episodes keeping secrets from the people around them. And that's a very powerful thing in storytelling, is the keeping of secrets and watching people as they try and hide from others, hide themselves.
We have that in Mad Men as well. The pilot is all about Don, shockingly revealing at the end of the pilot that he is married. The whole entire pilot, you think that he's this playboy in the city, and then the reveal at the end that he's got a wife and children is so shocking. And then the whole that series is so brilliant, the way it plays with identity, and because he's not really Don Draper, he's Dickie, he's someone else who stole someone's
Absolutely,
identity.
he doesn't
in the
know who
war.
he is, or if he does know who he is, he's
That's
terrified
right.
of who he is. And it's very good on again, that's all built on the secret of who Don Draper is, and he doesn't know who he is. I mean, that's what provides the fuel for that story. It's very probably sometimes it got a little too subtle for me. I would often get to the end of an episode and think, what did I just watch, and why was it there? It was so subtextual. It was like literature, actually. But what I was convinced of, and this is something I'm not convinced of often when I read books, is there was something there that I needed to understand. And the failure was on my part, not on the storyteller's part. And if I wanted to go and think about it enough, I would be able to understand what that storyteller was getting at. And I think that's, you've got to have that faith in your writer. And there was something that happened in academic studies probably 50 years ago, maybe, with the French intellectuals. If you come across the death of the author, the idea, I think it was Derrida, or was it said, the author doesn't really matter, it's the reader and what they make of the text. And I think that's utter rubbish. I mean, I think it's about you saying, if you trust your writer, to go and say, well, what's he trying to say? And I know there are exceptions, a bit like, Shakespeare, who's capable of so many interpretations. But that's the dramatic art, and that's a slightly different thing. That's slightly different from writing a novel. I think a novel, you have to give respect to the author, and you have to trust them that they're trying to say something to you without saying it, and you've got to try and work out what it is. And the only reason they're not saying it is because it cannot be said, not directly. In the same way that what's Hamlet about? I don't know. But I know it's about something very, very important. And I know that it's about death, and I know it's about uncertainty, and I know it's about choice, and I know it's about, well, so many things, but it's about something. And what I'm trying to say to writers is, you've got to be writing about something. Otherwise, you're not writing anything at all. You're just writing a series of vignettes. And, I'm not particularly interested in vignettes.
Well, there's a perception out there that artists and writers and even composers just kind of sit around and wait for inspiration to strike them. How much structure should there be to the practice of writing, do you think?
Well, that's a very good question, and not an easy one to answer. I mean, I'm very lucky in that, for some reason, I mean, I was, I don't have a literature degree. I'm not very well educated. I come from quite a modest, less than modest background. But I could just, when I wrote my first novel, I could just do it. I just came to me very, very naturally. And when I look back now, my first novel, it's perfectly structured, but I didn't know anything about structure. It's only that now that I've sought to drag up what it was that I was doing on an unconscious level, and so I could try and share it with other people, that I understand that. I really think that, as I said before, a novel is an organic thing. It's not a constructed thing. But then a beautiful garden, is an organic thing, but you still design it to some extent. Otherwise, it's just a mess. I'm very wary of, although I've written a book on writing novels, I'm very wary of teaching people about writing novels. I think there's strictly limited amount that you can show. It's your imagination. I spend a lot of time lying in bed just thinking about, if I'm writing a story, trying to, I'm not structuring anything. I'm just playing. I'm playing, in my head with possibilities. I'm imagining. That's the important stuff. That can't be taught. But what can be taught is how you can marshal all that raw material of your imagination and start to put it into some kind of shape. And that shape is, at its simplest, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Not that complicated, really. You can keep playing with that act structure, and people do to a tremendous extent, I mean, Shakespeare wrote in 5 acts. But you have to understand what an act is and what it does and how it divides a story up, because the story is all about turning points. All 3 act structure is the opening, a turning point, the middle, a turning point, the end. And it's how a story turns, and that might be as a result of a choice or an event. But the story has to constantly be turning, which brings us back to change. I think we were talking about change at some point, and change is, as it were, located within those turning points. And all that those act divisions are between Act 1 and Act 2 and Act 2 and Act 3 are big turning points. But there are little turning points should be going on all the way through your story. When people's perceptions and circumstances are turning, they're turning all the time. And that's what makes us interested to watch this process of change. And if there's no change, you have a static story.
Well, Tim, I love all of this nuts and bolts stuff, and that we're talking about story, but this next part is the part that I think we need to put just a little bit of time into, because I have been lucky enough to attend Robert McKee's seminar, and sort of met my wife at one of them 15 years ago. I would say that the world now is, in terms of storytelling outlets, is very different. And so something that's perhaps troubled us for years now this is just one aspect of it. It's maybe what we would call a writer's room cancer that sort of infected many of the places we go to consume stories. It could be it's the novels you talk about. You could maybe talk about the British novel industry. You could talk about I know a lot of people who work in writers' rooms, and you could take your pick. It's sort of a kind of elite, educated Californian worldview that dashes anything dangerous or original on grounds that it's not appropriate or not representative enough, or take your pick. So you said earlier that we have a lot of darkness in us, and you gave an example that I would have heard, and I heard it almost could have come out of McKee's mouth. He gave examples from concentration camps and all sorts of stuff that was heady, and exactly what we love art for is that we should be thinking about you know, how to the human side of the serial killer, the human side of this, and seeing things not in black and white. So
of the rapist, maybe.
You're a lot. See, there you go. I'm even censoring myself right now, and you can tell. But that's exactly what we're talking about. You should be able to stand your ground as a writer and say, yeah, anyway, my main character's a rapist, and we find that out, I don't know, halfway through or something or whatever. And so how do this is, we're obsessed with this problem. So before we can get back to talking about stories, what's your perspective on what I've outlined here, this writer's room cancer, or whatever you want to call it?
I think it's bigger than the writer's room. I mean, I think there's a kind of closing down of the imagination. There's a kind of closing down of what may be examined, what may be inspected in some ways. It's a very, what's the word? It's a very polarized way of looking at the world. It doesn't give bad people agency in a way, and it doesn't accept that we are all potentially bad. I mean, anyone who's seen the film Downfall with Bruno Ganz as Hitler, I mean, they made that guy a human being. Now that was a hell of a task, but they did it.
You're sort of disappointed for him that he totally blew it. Like, and you go, geez.
I can see the headline now. Podcast host says he is disappointed for Hitler. Yeah. I mean, but that's to me that's great storytelling. Because these people are complicated. And I mean, I've been trying for some time to. Well, I've given up now, but I wanted to write a book about domestic abuse, but the domestic abuser was a woman, and I just thought no one's ever going to publish that. But there are a lot of domestic abusers who are women, but you just would not. That's going to be off the. So that's the kind of thing you're talking about. I think it's called the Overton window, the sort of window within which certain ideas can be discussed. And that window seems to me very small at the moment. And I'm very reluctant to get into discussions about, political correctness, partly because of the climate we're living in and the accusation that can very easily be thrown at you that you are a dinosaur, like, centrist dad or whatever. But it's all outrageous to me. I mean, I'm an old school liberal. I think that one should absolutely be able to, as an artist, be able to explore anything you want, and it might be offensive and it might be challenging. Same in universities. I feel that people have. I mean, when I went to university, which is a fairly long time ago, my ideas about the world were brutally challenged, and it was very uncomfortable. And I really did suffer trying to justify my points of view. But that was good for me. And now the desire to not make people feel uncomfortable, I don't know. It worries me. I mean, I'm very worried about the cultural universe. In the widest sense, I think it's becoming very narrow. I'm hoping it will swing back. It will swing back sooner or later, but people have been saying that for years. And there's still very good storytelling within those parameters. But I would just wish I could watch something a bit more scary, and I don't mean scary in a horror film, mate. Something that's going to disturb me, and say, yeah, there are women abusers, there are, rapists are human. I mean, everyone's a human being. Hitler was a human being. It's this exploration of turning everything into a Victorian melodrama strikes me as a backward step.
But this, it's interesting because the politics. I mean, I think we're all on a unity ticket. I'm a lot more interested in art, and I just don't think that the politics is so oppressive right now. But when people say this thing of like, I don't know, I just think objectively that if we just talk about aesthetics, there was better art being made a little while ago. Do you know what I mean? Like I know, I just know it. There's not a lot of portfolios that I know in this world. There's so much I don't know, but I tell you what, I've seen a lot of movies and I read a few books, and I can tell you objectively that you know that even the '90s was vastly superior to what we see now, embarrassingly. And because I remember at the time, around about the year 2000, I was like, "Geez, man, what a terrible time this was." But in terms of art. But now you look back and you go, "Oh my god!" Like Train Spotting or Infinite Jest or Pulp Fiction, or I mean, just take your pick of Mike Lee's Naked. It doesn't matter. I mean, think about Naked. Which is a masterwork. Like the lead character is basically a rapist. Like, I mean, that's what the people would hang on to. But at the end, I feel everything for this character. I hate him. I love him. My heart hurts. I'm sad. I'm overjoyed, and I just can't even imagine that even Mike Leigh himself would be able to walk into anywhere now and pitch that and get it across the line. And it's dreadful.
Well, culture kind of died in the 20th century. That was the last. All that we do now is plunder the 20th century for our ideas, in the 21st century, and that there's not much left of unique. We're still, obviously, the Marvel and DC universes are an obvious example, but but from the Lord of the Rings back, I mean, everything is basically been stolen from the 20th century. We're not really coming up with much. There are a few exceptions. Charlie Kaufman is my hero as a writer, who produces remarkable pieces time and time again. And you come across a film now and then, and you think, "Wow, that's special." But the mainstream is not exciting me very much. But I mean, I'm more, I see more good TV than I read good books by a long way. Films, not so much so. I mean, the film industry is fairly barren at the moment, I think.
Well, I'm changing direction a little bit here, but while we still have you, I wanted to talk a little bit about criticism and feedback, and how artists should take criticism, because you obviously you teach writing, so I guess you're criticizing in a way people's work
Dole it out.
quite
A bit of
often.
criticism.
You dole out a bit of criticism, or constructive criticism, I guess you could say. But I was in a situation a few years back where an actor, an aspiring playwright, asked me to read their play and give them some feedback. And I won't name names, but I had to struggle through their long play, and then after giving my thoughts, was rewarded with an essay-long email justifying all their bad ideas, explaining why my feedback was wrong and why essentially I just didn't get it. So what should people do with constructive criticism, and do you think most people out there, they just want validation, that they don't even want the feedback?
Yeah, no, I sympathise with you, with your friend, and I mean, I'm faced with this all the time because I read people's manuscripts, on a weekly basis, and have to feed back to them, and I pride myself on being honest with people. I think one of the things that's gone wrong with the creative writing industry is that it's just become a big circle jerk. That everybody tells each other how wonderful they are, and I think that's not helpful for anybody. So, I will say, people, this doesn't work, and this is why it doesn't work. And it hurts people, it hurts people because they all, as you say, want validation. Above all, they want people to say you're a genius and this is going to be a bestseller. But that's, to put it mildly, that's rare. Mostly, I think that the trouble is because of this sort of whole idea of anybody can do anything culture, we can all be geniuses, just look within and look at the amazing person you really are. Well, most people aren't that amazing, are they? Most people are fairly dull. And the reality is that very few people can write a decent novel. However, they can learn to be better storytellers than they are currently. And that's all I ever offer people, is sort of say, well, if you work hard and think about these things, you can improve what you've written. But it's yes, I do think people, of course, I want validation. Everybody wants validation. I mean, that's only human. And there are plenty of creative writing teachers who are also willing to give it. Because, well, why wouldn't they? They've got the money. It feels good to give validation. Oh, this is great. It's got a few problems that I can, you can sort out, but really you're doing great. That feels nice. Feels nice for you. Feels nice for the person who's submitted the work. Having to say to somebody, one of the most awkward questions. I remember a very clearly one interview I had with a very nice woman, not a terrific writer, way back 5 or 6 years ago at least. And I was meeting them in a cafe, and they said to me, look, Tim, I want you to know. Do you tell me the truth? So, do you think I can do this? Do you think I have it in me?
Oh no!
And my answer, I'm trying to remember my answer, but it was a very awkward moment. And I said, well, something like, I think there are probably better ways you can spend your time, given the amount of awful competition there is in the markets, and but it comes up time and time again, and it's coming up right now. I'm reading a manuscript that I'm struggling with greatly, a rather too long manuscript that feels even longer than it actually is. And I've got to meet the author who is hoping that I'm going to tell them it's a really good piece of work, and I'm going to have to inform them that it isn't. And that's going to be awkward. But on the whole, the people who come to me, at least, either give up the moment I say to them, you need to do a lot of work. And probably 30% of people on the first meeting out of 10, I sell my mentoring as 10 meetings. Probably 20 to 30% just walk away because they can't deal with the fact that I haven't said they're great. But 80% take it on the chin in a very grown-up way, and they're the people who've got a chance of becoming writers because they can listen. And it's really hard to listen, when you're trying to learn to write, because it's complicated. It's very complicated. It's very complex, and people have got this sort of vague idea that this ridiculous idea that everyone can write a novel. I mean, yeah, everyone can write a novel, a very, very bad novel. Everyone can write a very, very bad novel. It'll just be very, very bad, but to write a novel that comes close to publishable quality is extraordinarily difficult. It's like, it's really, really hard. And if you think otherwise, do you think you can conduct a symphony orchestra? Do you think? I mean, it's a real complicated. Not many people can write novels. I mean, one's confused sometimes because the only people who seem to get publishing contracts nowadays are celebrities who knock out a novel. And I don't know how that works really. I presume a lot of them have ghostwriters, but then they inevitably sell, huge amounts of copies. But they seem to be the exceptions to the rule that celebrities can write novels. But something funny is going on there, and I suspect that, as I say, they have a fair amount of professional help in drafting their stuff, and it sells because they're celebrities. But yeah, I mean, how do you cope with it? I don't know. It's an ongoing problem. I understand very profoundly how much writers have got invested in their work, and that's why I often say that creative writing has become like a branch of therapy in many ways. People come to it to tell their stories, and they want their stories validated, because often these stories are very autobiographical.
Do you think that sort of autobiographical element to writing now, has that got something to do with the sort of broader oppressive culture we were talking about, where there's this idea now that you can only talk about what your direct experience, what you have experience with, like, stay in your lane sort of thing, which only really lends itself to memoir, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, your truth or my
Yeah.
truth. Well, it's fair enough. My truth is fair enough. I mean, I think that, each of us have only got our truths. We've only got a limited amount of processing power as human beings. But having said that, firstly, your truth isn't really your truth because you haven't thought about it enough. And the truth about who you are is much more complicated than you believe it to be. And therefore, if you're going to write, for instance, a successful memoir, since we mentioned memoir, you have to be asking yourself a lot of very uncomfortable questions about who you are in order for it to be interesting to a reader, because they have got to go on that journey with you, as opposed to just laying out the things that happen to you in your life, which is unbelievably dull unless you're a huge superstar, in which people will eat that stuff up. But I mean, not if you're Joe Schmo from Nowheresville. I mean, you've got to have something to say and to investigate, and that will usually be your your shadow, you might say, the things
But
you
Tim,
don't know.
don't you think the question, there's a line I think of from the making of The Shining where Kubrick says at one point, he says, he goes about a take that he just saw. He said, it's real, but it's just not particularly interesting. So
Oh yeah.
I think that's a brilliant. Why do these people? I think most people need to. Why are we afraid of delivering that advice? Which is, or no, it's not even advice. It's a question. It's who cares? Like, and there's so many writers who can answer it brilliantly with the work. I read it and I go, who cares? I care. I read it and it was amazing. You got it. You just, it might be particular to you. It might not be. It doesn't matter. But there's so many people who I feel embarking on this adventure and are frightened to ask them that, because you should ask yourself, right? Shouldn't you say, who cares? And then go, and then if you've got the answer.
Absolutely. Although that can cut both ways. There's lots of people who don't ask themselves the question, who cares, and should do. Then there are people who are good writers who ask themselves the question, who cares, who's going to care about my story? And actually, it's a more interesting story than they realise sometimes. And certainly my favourite title for a book of creative writing, I can't remember who wrote it, is called Nobody Wants to Read Your Shit.
That's Pressfield.
And I think
Pressfield.
Stephen Pressfield. That's right. Yeah, I mean that just says it all. I mean, nobody wants to read your shit. And
You
and,
picked it
and
out because I've got this Spartan attitude from Pressfield. I was just, it's like, no one cares. Steal yourself, get your shield out, point your cannon towards yourself.
Right about that.
Get out
Absolutely, there. I agree with him entirely. You can't try and steal 8 hours of somebody's life with your boring, inconsequential book. You've got to give them something in return. For that irreplaceable 8 hours of existence that they're giving over to your book. So I absolutely agree with you. I mean, and the question is, and the question I try and address is, how do you make people interested? Because if they're not interested, they're being cheated at some level.
Well, Tim, I want to give you the final word on the book, on the discussion, on anything we've left out today. So, yeah, go for it.
Okay. So what is my takeaway with writing? Well, be honest would be number one. Be honest with your ambition, be honest with yourself, and be humble, because if you're expecting an easy ride because you're a genius, well, you're not, and it's not going to be an easy ride. I mean, people are I'm always amazed when I get sort of manuscripts and I say, well, this is okay, but you're going to have to rewrite the whole thing. And I go, what do you mean? And it's like, I mean, I've spent probably in one of my books, I've spent 7 years rewriting it. It's just like, but they kind of get shocked, that you ask them to rewrite it once. Writing is rewriting, and you have to write and write and write and write and write. It's also quite boring a lot of the time, and it's vexatious and frustrating and upsetting. And again, this myth has taken root that it's, writing is fun. Well, it is fun if you're an amateur and you want to go to your local writers group and everyone tell you how. I've been to enough writers groups to know that everyone tells everyone else how great they are, even when the stuff is appalling. People will still sort of big up the person and say, "Oh, this is such an interesting piece," and that that's what people mainly go to writing courses for. But that's why they shouldn't come to me. If you want to be taught writing, and I do mentor people on a one-to-one basis, though I am quite expensive, but I do it, but don't come to me if you just want your ego tickled. I can try and teach you how to write, but it's not easy, and it takes a lot of inner toughness, and that's been true for writers throughout the ages. Writing is always a struggle. It always has been. It always will be. And, although I can offer some help with my book, in very limited help, finally it's down to you. And in that sense, I'm not about the death of the author. I'm about the rebirth of the author. It's your job, not mine, to write a novel for you. So that's my last word.
Well, the book is called Yes, No, But Wait.
Very good.
Oh, Tim, my reading was better than that.
Yeah,
okay, come on.
Whatever. Sort it out.
Is it available on audiobook or just physical?
That's a very good question. I haven't even checked. I mean, I don't know. Hopefully, if it's not available as an audiobook, then I might record it from my Substack. But it probably will. All my books are available as audiobooks. But I've got a new publisher with this one, so I don't know what their shtick is. But I imagine it is. But because I don't know if it's when it's published in Australia, to be honest.
I believe I'm going to take a stab and say I reckon it's early August.
Okay, good. Well, it's a while yet, but in the meantime, if you come to my Substack page, there's lots of material on there that is in the book that you can use. Okay. So, thanks so much. I enjoyed that very much. Really nice, in-depth conversation.
Thank you for listening to the New Flesh podcast. If you like our work, please consider rating us on Apple Podcasts or even writing us a review. It really does help the show reach a wider audience. We'll be back with another episode next week. Until then, long live the New Flesh.